Section 32 of All About Coffee. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. Read by Prajakta. All About Coffee by William Ukers. The Production and Consumption of Coffee. Part 2. Coffee consumption of the million or more tons of coffee produced in the world each year, practically all with the exception of that which is used in the coffee growing countries themselves, is consumed by the United States and Western Europe, the British dominions, and the non producing countries of South America. Over that vast stretch of territory, beginning with Western Russia and extending over almost the whole Asia, coffee is very little known. In the consuming regions mentioned, moreover, consumption is concentrated in a few countries which together account for some 90% of all the coffee that enters the world's markets. These are the United States, which now takes more than one half, and Germany, France, Spain, Italy, Holland, Belgium, Switzerland, and Scandinavia. The United Kingdom stands out conspicuously among the nations of Western Europe as a small consumer of coffee, the per capita consumption in that country being only about two-thirds of a pound each year. France and Germany are by far the biggest coffee buyers of Europe so far as actual quantity is concerned, although some of the other countries mentioned drink much more coffee in proportion to the population. The Mediterranean countries and the Balkans are of only secondary importance as coffee drinkers. Among the British dominions, the Union of South Africa takes much the largest amount, doubtless because of the Dutch element in its population, while Canada, Australia, and New Zealand show the influence of the mother country, consumption per head in the last two being no greater than in England. In South America, Brazil, Bolivia, and all the countries to the north are coffee producers. Of the southern countries, Argentina is the chief coffee buyer, with Chile second. In the Western Hemisphere, however, the largest per capita coffee consumer is the island of Cuba, which raises some coffee of its own and imports heavily from its neighbors. The list of coffee consuming countries includes practically all those that do not raise coffee and also a few that have some coffee plantations but do not grow enough for their own use. These countries are listed on page 287. Consumption figures can be determined with fair accuracy by the import figures, although in some countries where there is a considerable transit trade, it is necessary to deduct export from import figures to obtain actual consumption figures. The import figures given are the latest available for each country named. On account of the very wide fluctuations in imports during the war and the period following the war, per capita figures of consumption are of only relative value, as they have naturally changed radically in recent years. For the most part, however, the trade has about swung back to normal, and per capita figures based on the amounts retained for consumption, as given in the general coffee consumption table, are fairly close to those for the years before the war. As per capita calculations must take into account population as well as amounts of coffee consumed, and as population figures are usually estimates, the results arrived at by different authorities are likely to vary slightly, although usually they are not far apart. In figuring the per capita amounts in the table on page 288, latest available estimates of population have been used. The figures show that the following are the 10 leading countries in the per capita consumption of coffee in pounds. First, Sweden 15.25, second, Cuba 13.79, third, Denmark 13.19, fourth, United States 12.09, fifth, Belgium 11.06, sixth, Norway 10.95, 7, Holland 10.22, 8, Finland 8.25, 9, Switzerland 8.17, 10, France 7.74. The per capita consumption of the most important coffee consuming countries based on the large table is given with the 1913 per capita figures for comparison. Tea and coffee in England and the US. The rise of the United States as a coffee consumer in the last century and a quarter has been marked not only by steadily increased imports as the population of the country increased, but also by a steady growth in per capita consumption, showing that the beverage has been continually advancing in favor with the American people. Today, it stands at practically its highest point, each individual man, woman, and child having more than 12 pounds a year, enough for almost 500 cups, allotted to him as his portion. This is 4 times as much as it was 100 years ago, and more than twice as much as it was in the years immediately following the Civil War. In general, it is 50% more than the average in the 20 years preceding 1897, in which year a new high level of coffee consumption was apparently established, the per capita figure for that year being 10.12 pounds, which has been approximately the average since then. Since the advent of countrywide prohibition in the United States on July 1, 1919, about 2 pounds more coffee per person, or 80 to 100 cups, have been consumed than before. Part of this increase is doubtless to be charged to prohibition, but it is yet too early to judge fairly as to the exact effect of bone dry legislation on coffee drinking. The continued growth in the use of coffee in the United States has been in decided contrast to the per capita consumption of tea, which is less now than half a century ago. In the United Kingdom, the reverse condition prevails. Tea drinking there steadily maintains a popularity which it has enjoyed for centuries, while coffee apparently makes no advance in favor. In this respect, the country is sharply distinguished from its neighbors of Western Europe, in many of which coffee drinking has been much heavier, considering the population, even than in the United States. The contrast between the tastes of the two countries in beverages is shown clearly by the per capita figures of tea and coffee consumption for half a century, as they appear in the table next column. Coffee consumption in Europe. On the continent of Europe, however, coffee enjoys much the same sort of popularity that it does in the United States. The leading continental coffee ports are Hamburg, Bremen, Copenhagen, Amsterdam, Rotterdam, Antwerp, Halle, Bordeaux, Marseille, and Trieste, and the nationalities of these ports indicate pretty well the countries that consume the most coffee. The northern ports are transshipping points for large quantities of coffee going to the Scandinavian countries, as well as importing ports for their own countries, and these countries have been among the leading coffee drinkers per head of population for many decades. Norway, for instance, in 1876 was consuming about 8.8 pounds of coffee per person, Sweden 5 pounds, and Denmark 5.2 pounds. The per capita consumption of various other countries at about the same period, 1875 to 1880, has been estimated as follows: Holland 17.6 pounds, Belgium 9.1 pounds, Germany 5.1 pounds, Austria-Hungary 2.2 pounds, Switzerland 6.6 pounds, Spain 0.2 pounds, Portugal 0.7 pounds, and Greece 1.6 pounds. Today, the leading country of the world in point of per capita consumption is Sweden, 15.25 pounds, but Holland held that position for a long while. During the World War, the disturbance of trade currents and the high price of coffee greatly reduced the amount of coffee drinking, and the Dutch took to drinking tea in considerable quantities. France, second only to the United States in the total amount of coffee consumed, is France, although that country before the war occupied third place, being passed by Germany. However, is one of the great coffee ports of Europe and has a coffee exchange organized in 1882, only a short time after the exchange in New York began operations. France draws on all the large producing regions of her coffee, but is especially prominent in the trade in the West Indies and the countries around the Caribbean Sea. Imports in 1921 preliminary amounted to 322,419,884 pounds. Exports to 1,154,769 pounds, and net consumption to 321,265,115 pounds. Germany. Hamburg is one of the world's important coffee ports, and in normal times, coffee is brought there in vast amounts, not only for shipment into the interior of Germany, but also for transshipment to Scandinavia, Finland, and Russia. Up to the outbreak of the war, Germany was the chief coffee drinking country of Europe. During the blockade, the Germans resorted to substitutes, and after the war, because of high prices, there was still some consumption of them. German coffee imports since the war have not quite climbed back to their former high mark, and the per capita consumption, judged by these figures, is still somewhat low. Importations amounted to 90,602,000 pounds in 1920. The amount of total imports was 371,130,520 pounds in 1913. Total exports 1,783,521 pounds, and net imports 369,346,999 pounds. Netherlands. Netherlands is one of the oldest coffee countries of Europe and for centuries has been a great transshipping agent, distributing coffee from her East Indian possessions and from America among her northern neighbors. Before sending these coffee shipments along, however, she kept back enough plentifully to supply her own people, so that for many years before the war, she led the world in per capita consumption. As far back as 1867-76, coffee consumption was averaging more than 13 pounds per capita. In the year before the war, the average was 18.8 pounds. The blockade and the other abnormal conditions during the war threw the trade off, and it is still subnormal. In 1920, the net imports were about 96 million pounds, which would give a per capita consumption of about 14 pounds if it all went into consumption. But part of it was probably stored for later exportation as indicated by the figures for 1921, which show heavy exports and a consequent lower figure for consumption. 80% of the Netherlands coffee trade is handled through Amsterdam. Consumption of coffee is now slowly going back to normal, but the change in source of imports, which before the war came largely from Brazil, but which war conditions turned heavily toward the East Indies, is still in evidence. Other countries of Europe, Denmark, Norway, and Sweden, are all heavy coffee drinkers. In 1921, Sweden had the highest per capita consumption in the world, 15.25 pounds. Before the war, these three countries each consumed about as much as capita as the United States does today, 12 to 13 pounds. The 1921 imports for consumption were as follows: Denmark 43,122,417 pounds, Norway 29,665,623 pounds, Sweden 89,660,766 pounds. Austria-Hungary was formerly an important buyer of coffee, large quantities coming into the country yearly through Trieste. Imports in 1913 totaled 130,951,000 pounds, and in 1912 124,527,000 pounds. In 1917, the war cut down the total to 17,910,000 pounds net consumption. Finland shares with her neighbors of the Baltic a strong taste for coffee, importing in 1921 27,968,000 pounds, about 8.25 pounds per capita. In the same year, Belgium had a net importation of 83,824,000 pounds. Spain in 1920 consumed 48,513,821 pounds. Portugal in 1919 imported 6,926,575 pounds and exported 1,258,271 pounds, leaving 5,668,304 pounds for home consumption. Coffee is not especially popular in the Balkan states and Italy. Importations into the last named country in 1920 amounting to 66,494,925 pounds net. Switzerland is a steady coffee drinker, consuming 31,535,260 pounds in 1921. Russia was never fond of coffee, and her total imports in 1917, according to a compilation made under Soviet auspices, were only 4,464,000 pounds. Other countries. The Union of South Africa in 1920 imported 27,798,000 pounds net, or about 3.8 pounds per capita. Cuba purchased 39,981,696 pounds in the fiscal year 1920. Argentina 37,541,000 pounds in 1919. Chile 12,358,000 pounds in 1920. Australia 2,239,000 pounds in 1920, and New Zealand 283,633 pounds in that year. 3 centuries of coffee trading. The story of the development of the world's coffee trade is a story of about 3 centuries. When Columbus sailed for the New World, the coffee plant was unknown even as near its original home as his native Italy. In its probable birthplace in southern Abyssinia, the native had enjoyed its use for a long time, and it had spread to southwestern Arabia, but the Mediterranean knew nothing of it until after the beginning of the 16th century. It then crept slowly along the coast of Asia Minor through Syria, Damascus, and Aleppo until it reached Constantinople about 1554. It became very popular. Coffee houses were opened, and the first of many controversies arose. But coffee made its way against all opposition and soon was firmly established in Turkish territory. In those deliberate times, the next step westward from Asia to Europe was not taken for more than 50 years. In general, its introduction and establishment in Europe occupied the whole of the 17th century. The greatest pioneering work in coffee trading was done by the Netherlands East India Company, which began operations in 1602. The enterprise not only promoted the spread of coffee growing in two hemispheres, but it was active also in introducing the sale of the product in many European countries. Coffee reached Venice about 1615 and Marseilles about 1644. The French began importing coffee in commercial quantities in 1660. The Dutch began to import mocha coffee regularly at Amsterdam in 1663, and by 1679 the French had developed a considerable trade in the berry between the Levant and the cities of Lyons and Marseilles. Meanwhile, the coffee drink had become fashionable in Paris, partly through its use by the Turkish ambassador, and the first Persian cafe was opened in 1672. It is significant of its steady popularity since then that the name cafe, which is both French and Spanish for coffee, has come to mean a general eating or drinking place. Active trading in coffee began in Germany about 1670 and in Sweden about 1674. Trading in coffee in England followed swiftly upon the heels of the opening of the first coffee house in London in 1652. By 1700, the trade included not only exporting and importing merchants but wholesale and retail dealers, the latter succeeding the apothecaries who, up to then, had enjoyed a kind of monopoly of the business. Trade and literary authorities on coffee trading tell us that in the early days of the 18th century, the chief supplies of coffee for England and Western Europe came from the East Indies and Arabia. The Arabian, or as it was more generally known, Turkey berry, was bought first hand by Turkish merchants who were accustomed to travel inland in Arabia Felix and to contract with native growers. It was moved thence by camel transport through Judea to Grand Cairo via Suez to be transshipped down the Nile to Alexandria, then the great shipping port for Asia and Europe. By 1722, 60,000 to 70,000 barrels of Turkish, that is Arabian coffee, a year were being received in England, the sale price of Grand Cairo being fixed by the Bashaw, who valorized it according to the supply. Indian coffee, which was also grown in Arabia, was brought to Bet el Faqih in the mountains of southwestern Arabia, where English, Dutch, and French factors went to buy it and to transport it on camels to Mocha, whence it was shipped to Europe around the Cape of Good Hope. In the beginning, Indian coffee was inferior to Turkish coffee because it was the refuse or what remained after the Turkish merchants had taken the best. But after the European merchants began to make their own purchases at Bettelfukir, the character of the Indian product as sold in the London and other European markets was vastly improved. Doubtless, the long journey in sailing vessels over tropic seas made for better quality. It was estimated that Arabia in this way exported about a million bushels a year of Turkish and Indian coffee. The coffee houses became the gathering places for wits, fashionable people, and brilliant and scholarly men, to whom they afforded opportunity for endless gossip and discussion. It was only natural that the lively interchange of ideas at these public clubs should generate liberal and radical opinions, and that the constituted authorities should look askance at them. Indeed, the consumption of coffee has been curiously associated with movements of political protest in its whole history, at least up to the 19th century. Coffee has promoted clear thinking and right living wherever introduced. It has gone hand in hand with the world's onward march toward democracy. As already told in this work, royal orders closed the coffee houses for short periods in Constantinople and in London. Germany required a license for the sale of the beverage. The French Revolution was fomented in coffee house meetings, and the real cradle of American liberty is said to have been a coffee house in New York. It is interesting also to note that while the consumption of coffee has been attended by these agitations for greater liberty for 3 centuries, its production for 3 centuries in the Dutch East Indies, in the West Indies, and in Brazil was very largely in the hands of slaves or of forced labor. Since the spread of the use of coffee to Western Europe in the 17th century, the development of the trade has been marked, broadly speaking, by two features. First, the shifting of the weight of production, first to the West Indies, then to the East Indies, and then to Brazil. And second, the rise of the United States as the chief coffee consumer of the world. Until the close of the 17th century, the little district in Arabia, whence the coffee beans had first made their way to Europe, continued to supply the whole world's trade. But springs of coffee trees were beginning to go out from Arabia to other promising lands, both eastward and westward. As previously related, the year 1699 was an important one in the history of this expansion, as it was then that the Dutch successfully introduced the coffee plant from Arabia into Java. This started a Far Eastern industry whose importance continues to this day, and also caused the mother country Holland to take up the role of one of the leading coffee traders of the world, which she still holds. Holland, in fact, took to coffee from the very first. It is claimed that the first samples were introduced into that country from Mocha in 1616, long before the beans were known in England or France, and that by 1663 regular shipments were being made. Soon after the coffee culture became firmly established in Java, regular shipments to the mother country began, the first of these being a consignment of 894 pounds in 1711. Under the auspices of the Netherlands East India Company, the system of cultivating coffee by forced labor was begun in the East Indian colonies. It flourished until well into the 19th century. One result of this colonial production of coffee was to make Holland the leading coffee consumer per capita of the world. Consumption in 1913, as recorded on page 290, having reached as high as 18.8 pounds. It has long been one of the leading coffee traders, importing and exporting in normal times before the war between 150 million and 300 million pounds a year. The introduction of the coffee plant into the New World took place between 1715 and 1723. It quickly spread to the islands and the mainland washed by the Caribbean. The latter part of the 18th century saw tens of millions of pounds of coffee being shipped yearly to the mother countries of Western Europe, and for decades, the two great coffee trade currents of the world continued to run from the West Indies to France, England, Holland, and Germany, and from the Dutch East Indies to Holland. These currents continued to flow until the disruption of world trade routes by the World War, but they had been pushed into positions of secondary importance by the establishing of the two new currents, running respectively from Brazil to Europe and from Brazil to the United States, which constituted the 19th century's contribution to the history of the world's coffee trade. The chief feature of the 20th century's developments has been the passing by the United States of the halfway mark in world consumption. This country, since the second year of the World War, having taken more than all the rest of the world put together. The world's chief coffee stream, so to speak, is now from Santos and Rio de Janeiro to New York, other lesser streams being from these ports to Havre, Antwerp, Amsterdam, and in normal times Hamburg, and from Java to Amsterdam and Rotterdam. It is said that a movement fostered by Belgium and Brazil is underway to have Antwerp succeed Hamburg as a coffee port. The rise of Brazil to the place of all important source of the world's coffee was entirely 19th century development. When the coffee tree found its true home in southern Brazil in 1770, it began at once to spread widely over the area of excellent soil, but there was little exportation for 30 or 40 years. By the middle of the 19th century, Brazil was contributing twice as much to the world's commerce as her nearest competitor, the Dutch East Indies, exports in 1852-53 being 2,353,563 bags from Brazil and 1,190,543 bags from the Dutch East Indies. The world's total that year was 4,567,000 bags, so that Brazilian coffee represented about one half of the total. This proportion was roughly maintained during the latter half of the 19th century, but has gradually increased since then to its present three-fourths. The most important single event in the history of Brazilian production was the carrying out of the valorization scheme by which the state of Sao Paulo in 1906 and 7 purchased 8,474,623 bags of coffee and stored it in Santos in New York and in certain European ports in order to establish the price in the face of very heavy production. At the same time, a law was passed limiting the exports to 10 million bags per year. This law has since been repealed. The story of valorization is told more fully in chapter 31. The coffee thus purchased by the state was placed in the hands of an international committee which fed it into the world's markets at the rate of several 100,000 bags a year. Good prices were realized for all coffee sold, and the plan was successful not only financially but in the achievement of its main object, the prevention of the ruin of planters through overproduction. Another valorization campaign was launched by Brazil in 1918 and a third in 1921. Early in 1918, the Sao Paulo government bought about 3 million bags. Subsequent events caused a sharp advance in prices and at one time it was said that the holdings showed a profit of $60 million. The Brazil federal government appointed an official director of valorization, Count Alexander Siciliano. A federal loan of £9 million with 4,535,000 bags of valorized coffee as collateral was placed in London and New York in May 1922. European consumption during the last century has been marked by the growth of imports into France and Germany, these being the two leading coffee drinkers of the world, aside from the United States. Germany held the lead in European consumption during the whole of the 19th century and also in this century until all imports were stopped by the Allied navies, although in actual imports, Holland for many years showed higher figures. Both Holland and England have acted as distributors, re exporting each year most of the coffee which entered their ports. In the last half century, the chief consumers in the order named have been Germany, France, Holland, Austria Hungary, and Belgium. However, with the removal of the duty on coffee in the last named country in 1904, imports trebled and Belgium took third place. The table at the top of this page shows the general trend of the trade for the last 70 years. Most of the coffee for these countries has for many years been supplied by Brazil, even Holland bringing in several times as much from Brazil as from the Dutch East Indies. Special features of the European trade have been the organization in 1873 and successful operation in Germany of the world's first international syndicate to control the coffee trade and the opening of coffee exchanges in Haver in 1882, in Amsterdam and Hamburg in 1887, in Antwerp, London, Rotterdam in 1890, and in Trieste in 1905. The advance of coffee consumption in the United States, the chief coffee consuming country in the world, has taken place through about the same period as the advance of production in Brazil, the chief producing country, but it has been far less rapid. From 1790 to 1800, coffee imports for consumption ranged from 3,500,000 to 32 million pounds. The figures in the next column show the net importations of the coffee into this country since the beginning of the 19th century. The chief source of supply, of course, has been Brazil, and the commercial and economic ties created by this immense coffee traffic has knit the two countries closely together. Brazil is probably more friendly to the United States than any other South American country, as shown by her action in following this country into the World War against Germany. She also grants the United States certain tariff preferentials as a recognition of the continued policy of this country of admitting coffee free of duty. The chief port of entry of coffee into the United States is New York, which for decades has recorded entries amounting from 60 to 90% of the country's total. Since 1902, New Orleans has shown a big advance and in 1910 imported some 35% of the total. The only other port of importance is San Francisco, where imports have been increasing in recent years because of the growth of the trade in Central American coffee. Throughout the century and a third of steady increase of importations of coffee, Congress has for the most part permitted its free entry, as a rule resorting to taxation of the poor man's breakfast cup only when in need of revenue for war purposes. At times, the free entry has been qualified, but for the most part, coffee has been free from the burden of customs tariff. The country's coffee trade before the Civil War was without special incident, but since that time, The continued growth has brought about manipulations that have often resulted in highly dramatic crises. Organizations to exercise some sort of regulation in the trade, the development of a trade in substitutes, the advance of the sale of branded packaged coffee, the institution of large advertising campaigns, and other interesting features. These are treated more in detail in chapters that follow. End of section 32.